Tonight we're here to talk about subspecies. So for those of you that know Richard, he needs no introduction, but for those of you that don't, Richard Littauer has moved to Vermont a few years back and took the Vermont birding community world by storm and has been investing a ton of time into some of the nitty gritty of birding that a lot of people don't spend a whole lot of time on. And so it's been awesome watching the Vermont birding community grow and learn together, especially over the last 10, 15 years here. And it seems like the community's kind of moved towards a closer look at a lot of our backyard birds. And so I'm really excited to turn things over to Richard Littauer and have us spend an evening looking into subspecies. One quick housekeeping thing I just remembered I wanted to mention. This program is also being put on by the Green Mountain Audubon Society, and a lot of our bird programs have been lately. So thank you very much to the Green Mountain Audubon Society. And if you have any questions as we go throughout, please feel free to throw them in the chat. That'll come to me, and I'll moderate those questions. If it's super relevant to what Richard's talking about, I might interject it. Otherwise, I'll hold things till the end. But thanks, welcome, and take it away, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And it's great to be here. It's great to be here on behalf of North Branch. North Branch is awesome. It's down the road from me. It's one of the most welcoming places. I moved to Montpelier a few years ago as a struggling actor, certainly not in my day job, but let's pretend that's what I do, which is why I have a Shakespeare reference here. What's in a name? And North Branch was really, really welcoming. So I'm really happy to be able to give this talk. To start out with, I have a few disclaimers just to give right off the bat to just kill any confidence you might have in me as a speaker. So first off, I'm not a professional biologist. I'm just a guy who likes to look at birds. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that we are on unceded Abenaki land here in Vermont. And I don't know what the Abenaki would have called a lot of these birds, but they have different names for them. And if anyone's interested, I think you should get in touch with the Abenaki people, particularly the Nullhegan band is doing a lot of stuff there. I hope to in the future. So that's just something to say. And the other thing I have to say is that I speak English and I speak it incredibly fast. So if ever at any point you feel like I'm too fast, please let Sean know. The fastness is a direct function of my nervousness. So sorry if I'm just talking very fast. It's because I'm just overwhelmed by all the time that you're giving to me. So thank you so much. So bait and switch, this actually isn't going to be about birds at all. It's just going to be about Shakespeare. So here is, if it can work, the first quote: "A rose by any other name may smell as sweet, but without a name, it is simply a flower." This is a really nice bastardization of a Shakespeare quote, which was quoted by David Sibley in Birding Basics, quoting Jim Wright and Jerry Barrick, Presence of Nature. I really like this. Because it says what we're doing as birders, right? Birders identify birds. So to the audience, I'm an avid birder. I know many of the people here are as well. And birders like to go out and look and put names on things, figure out what things are. And to put names on things, you have to know what the thing is and what the name is. And I like that. So interesting. This is the first bird I want to start with today. So this is a northern cardinal. You all probably recognize this bird. It's a pretty sweet bird. They're red. This one is a male. They come to feeders all the time here in Vermont. You're probably used to hearing their familiar chink, chink from bushes that you walk past, maybe on a walking trail. And take a close look at this bird. And just see that, you know, it has the tall crest. It has a black mask. It looks almost like a cardinal of the church. Here's another northern cardinal. It's a bit duller, isn't it? It's obviously not summertime. This shot is a bit different. Some of you might recognize Matthew Bode's name. He's a local Vermont photographer. So he took this photo. It's got kind of a sort of brownish, grayish back. And the crest is, you know, it's there. It's got a crest as well. They're both males. So what's interesting is that these are actually different. They're different subspecies. And I'm going to get to why in a second. So the northern cardinal, one of our most common birds here, has 18 different subspecies, which have been recognized formally by taxonomists. That's super cool, right? There's a lot of different variants of subspecies out there of this bird. So there's two groupings on eBird. We'll get to what groupings mean later, but two basically giant groups, or, you know, here's how the subspecies subdivide. And that follows the American Ornithological Society and the Clements list. And there's Ridgway says there's three. DNA tests have showed 6 intraspecific clades, which is a fancy word. I tried to copy what that might mean here. This is the actual quote from the paper that says that in Birds of the World. Mitochondrial ND2 gene analysis by Smith et al. Find 6 intraspecific clades, 4 subspecies groups that show strong support for phylogenetic structure and following pattern in Newick form, the Carnus, Carnalis, Saturatus, Cochineus. It's very confusing. It's a lot of text. It's very, and trying to understand that is tough. But if you do it, you might figure things out. And here's what you might figure out. Of the two groupings, we have the long-crested and the common. So this is a long-crested. You can tell because it has that long crest. This is the same bird as was in the first photo. It's a bit worse of a photograph here. I wish I had a better photograph, but it's hard to find ones that were Creative Commons licensed. But you can see it has this really long crest compared to our birds. Here's a female, same size crest as the male here in Vermont. It's a bit shorter, isn't it? You know, it kind of just looks like a nice little tuft, almost looks like a tufted titmouse. It's not the same as this super long crest. Short crest. And then the female, the face mask isn't always black. I don't have a photo of the female long crested. I wish I did. But what's interesting here is you can tell short crest, long crest. That's because this is the Cardinalis carneus subspecies in the long crested grouping. It's the only subspecies in that grouping. And this one is Cardinalis, the nominate subspecies in the common grouping. So that's kind of cool. We've already learned something today. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, Richard, that's great. I came here to learn what subspecies are. All you've done is thrown jargon at me. I am guilty for that. I apologize. So what is a subspecies? And I have my most aggressive looking bird here, the Quiscalus quiscula versicolor, the common grackle, a bronze subspecies to keep me on my toes. Looks kind of like a dinosaur there, and I'm afraid I'm going to get eaten if I mess up. So a subspecies is first and foremost a noun. It's a word in English. Subspecies has 2 major morphemes in it, sub and species. It's the same in the singular as it is in the plural. I saw many subspecies today is a correct thing to say. Subspecies isn't correct. Now we all know. A subspecies is also the third word in Catharus catatus faxani. It's the third word in the trinomen, right? So the first one, Catharus, says that this hermit thrush is a Catharus bird. It's a Catharus thrush. And the Catatus says that that would be a hermit thrush. And the Faxoni says it's the hermit thrush that we have here in Vermont. This is the nomenclature that was derived from Linnaeus' classification system, where they decided to put all of life into one giant tree where you can sort of trace how it's all connected. And we have genus, species, then subspecies. The third word is the subspecies. And it's the taxonomic rank in the taxonomy below subspecies, right? It's the lowest one. The last point is kind of interesting. A subspecies is a non-monotypic subgrouping. So you can't have a bird and then have a subspecies and no other subspecies. You can only have a subspecies designation for birds if there's more than one. This is because a subspecies is kind of a subgroup of a species. So it doesn't make sense for the subgroup to be the same size as the group. I hope that makes sense. If all birds are the same subspecies, then there's just no subspecies. It just doesn't work that way. So Ernst Mayr is one of the giants of taxonomic classification. And he wrote this really great essay called Of What Use Are Subspecies in 1982, where he said that subspecies are now simply a handle of convenience for the clerical work of the museum curator. Certainly gets the juices excited, doesn't it? Really makes you want to go out there and learn more. I have a friend who I showed this to the other day, and she said, well, actually, I am a museum curator, and that's really fascinating to me. It's really, really useful. And I'm like, well, you have a good point. But for the rest of us, that's kind of a funny thing to say, especially as a taxonomist. Who cares if it's the clerical work of a museum curator, right? Why are we interested? There's got to be more to it than that. It's just a way of naming things? Kind of not. Here are some things that in his paper he sort of mentions as possible subgroupings. This is not the only paper on subspecies, and there's a whole lot more to say, but here's just a small sampling of things he mentions. A subspecies would be a geographical subpopulation, a species, a group of population of a bird that only lives in one place. For instance, the cardinalis only lives on the East Coast, whereas the cardinalis long-crested lives in Mexico. Very different places. A genetic subset would also count as a subspecies, where the genes are actually different, the DNA is different. Darwin said that a subspecies is an incipient species, a species about to be. I like this a lot. Another good definition we already covered, the lowest recognized taxon. You can't go lower than a subspecies. That's how it is. We'll get to that in a second. And then another one, which I really liked, another quote directly from this paper, is that a subspecies is an index to populations that differ from each other taxonomically. And he also put that in quotes, which is funny because he's saying that a subspecies is a way of telling apart subspecies by subspecies. So it's kind of a circular definition there. And that's actually, it feels uncomfortable, right? I don't like that definition. In fact, I don't like any of these definitions because they all don't really cover where I am and where I want to be, right? The lowest recognized taxon, why can't you have further? Why can't you take it down to the individual? Incipient species? What does that even mean? Is a bird about to become something else all the time? If I'm staring at a bird, can I know what it is? Or is it about to be an eagle or a condor when it's just a house sparrow? It's very unsatisfying. So let's dig a bit further. What is a species, right? Maybe this is a better place to start. Well, Linnaeus, as I mentioned, this Swedish gent from the 1700s, said that everything it is possible for us to analyze depends on the clear method which distinguishes the similar from the not similar. I wonder if his sense of English would have been better if he could have said dissimilar. I don't know. But Linnaeus was a really excellent classifier. And he started this whole system of putting names on things in Latin. Obviously, people have been putting names on things since Adam and Eve, but, a bit after that. And by the way, this is the Professor raven I have here. It's one of my favorite photos. I really love its Latin name, Corvus corax clarionensis. This is the raven of the clarion call. So Professor Raven here to talk. So let's break it down how we could break down what a species might be. And there's different definitions of what a species is. And again, species is a way of dividing what's similar from the not similar in sense of not the genus, but like somewhere at the low level. So geographical range is a really good way of saying a species is different from a species. A species which, lives in a different area than another bird, biologically, it's really easy to classify them because you can just say, well, that bird lives over there and the other bird lives over there, right? European mergansers are different than American mergansers. Makes sense to me. It's a good way of doing it. What happens when they, when vagrants come through? What happens when they join together occasionally, when man shakes things up and they move around? Well, we need a better definition. So maybe morphology. Species are birds that look alike, right? If a bird looks like another bird, it's a bird. It's in coding, we call this duck typing. If it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's a duck. This works pretty well, but it also causes some problems. Linnaeus actually, at one point, included the male mallard and the female mallard as different species in his classification system until someone pointed out, that's probably not quite right. And that's where we get to biology, right? Species are different when they can breed with each other, when they're able to have viable populations that basically come from the same stock. If they can breed together and not have a fitness cost for their children, then they're the same species. Fitness cost means that maybe the kids can't have kids. For instance, a mule, it's a cross between a horse and a donkey, can't have children. It's sterile. That's a fitness cost. At the interchange of Western and Eastern yellow-rumped warblers, it's possible that the intergrades actually aren't as good at catching bugs and living. They have a fitness cost, which is one of the reasons that species may again be split, one of the reasons why it almost wasn't joined. Really interesting definition. But as you can tell by the example I just mentioned, maybe that's not perfect either. Taxonomically, we can divide up species. If someone called it something and someone else called it something else, maybe they're different. This is not a totally cyclical argument because you can always refer to other people's justifications, and other people often know more than you. Most people know more than me, if not everyone. But that's another way you can tell if species are different. And then this last one, phylogeny, hard word to spell and say, but I kind of like it a lot. It just sounds nice to me. Phylogeny is the DNA different. That's how you can tell a species is a species, right? And all of these are used at some points as ways of trying to figure out what a species is. None of them are perfect, but they're really useful for making useful declarations on what is similar and what is not similar, which is what we do in science. So let's talk about a bird in depth here, right? Here's the Savannah Sparrow, great little bird. Hello, singing away. And it's heavily philopatric. So it really always returns to the same place. Philopatria means love of the fatherland, right? So they always sort of hang out and breed exactly where they were born. They always go back to the same spot. There's 28 subspecies because of this. Some birds move around a lot. Savannah sparrows, not so much. Tend to breed at the same place, which means it's easy for them to eventually differentiate and, like the incipient species of Darwin, become something different. It's 5 groupings in those 28 species, so it breaks down. And the problem with this, and say, well, you 28 subspecies, that's great. 28 easily differentiated forms that breed in different places. Well, kind of. There's clinal differences. Clinal means that it's not an easy break between one subspecies and the other. They're sort of gently meld into each other, sort of like different dialects of English. Where is the line between Northern American English and Southern American English? Is it Virginia? Is it West Virginia? Is it Pownell? Who knows? Here's another problem with Savannah sparrow. Half of the subspecies are not morphologically distinct. Only half of them are morphologically distinct, which means you can look at them and be like, well, this one looks like the other one that kind of is next to. That's not really useful. We want to know if they're different, right? But that's just how it is. So another problem, at least 2 of the subspecies of the Savannah sparrow, the morphology doesn't always match the genetics. The genetics look really different. The genes look different, whereas they morphologically look very similar. And it's like, oh, okay, so I can't use one heuristic. I have to use another heuristic, and they're both breaking down. Great. And then here's another problem. Songs differ for some of these subspecies, but they haven't been studied very much. And songs is a really useful way that we know that species are different. We recently split off, I think, the cinereous owl from the barred owl. I believe that's right. Don't test me on that one. Because of the song being different. So, okay, what is it? And here's the Ipswich Sparrow. The Ipswich Sparrow used to be a full species, Passerculus princeps. It breeds on a small island. I think it's called Sable Island off of Maine. And it used to be a full species until it became a subspecies of the Savannah sparrow in some taxonomies. And this is the expert from the Ipswich Sparrow project, James Rising. That's where I found this quote. I'm not sure he's actually with it. Saying, the matter of the taxonomic rank of the Ipswich Sparrow is indeterminate and ultimately arbitrary. Which is great. I came here intentionally to teach you about species, and so far all I've told you is that there's doubt. It's like I'm reading Douglas Adams' book, The Salmon of Doubt, and just salmoning all over the place. I'm sorry. But I want to point out it's difficult, and it's tough, and it's ultimately arbitrary, like most things. So, how do these taxonomists who are having these deadly duels with each other, writing long, long rivers of ink, trying to get to the bottom of this, deal with species? Well, here's some philosophies or approaches that people have to speciation and towards the species problem, as it's called. What is a species? There's the essentialists. These are basically the Neoplatonists, right? They think that somewhere out there is a bird, and that bird's a bird, and all of the birds are like that bird or not. And somewhere out there is an Ipswich sparrow, and that's a real Ipswich sparrow. And that's not a Savannah sparrow, it's an Ipswich sparrow. As you can tell, this isn't a very useful thing to do, because how could you tell? Whether it matches up to the golden idea of what that sparrow is. If I have chairs here that are really great, they have backs on them, but I also have stools. Are the stools chairs? Well, I sit on them both. Well, that breaks down. So then there's the nominalist. Well, okay, let's not look at the idea of a thing. Let's look at the name of the thing. We call it this, therefore it's this. Also not useful. As we all know, names are arbitrary. Ernst Mayr, the guy I mentioned earlier, the great taxonomist, is a nominalist, and he points out this tribe in Western New Guinea that has 137 different species, which exactly matched what Western taxonomists came in and found 138 different species. And so because they're exactly the same, clearly species are real and the names we give them are real. And that's a really bad example because I'm colorblind and I couldn't go in and find those species. All that says is that humans are able to find 137 species there with normal eyesight. You can imagine a world in which there's someone who can't tell these birds apart and only finds 28. So are the names that we give them real? No, names are arbitrary. Another really good way of looking at this is this color spectrum. Why do we call red red and not green red? Well, our culture tells us what's red, but there's nothing that says the spectrum has to be broken up into these little discrete sections. It's arbitrary. It's passed on. So then there's the realist. Okay, no, there really is a thing out there, and it's separate from what we name it, and it's real, and it's not the same as the Platonic idea of a thing. It's like there is an Ipswich Sparrow and it exists. This isn't very useful. It doesn't help us say anything different. It's an interesting standpoint, and this doesn't have a lot of proponents. The pragmatists are everywhere. They're very good. Well, okay, screw it. We don't know what's going on. Let's just call a thing, and if we all agree it's a thing, that's really useful. Everyone with me? Okay, cool. And these, I like this one a lot, but it still isn't satisfying. Okay, do we all agree this is a word? This is the word? Great. Okay. How do you agree? What heuristics are you using? Well, that's where the pluralists go in, right? The pluralists say, well, let's just choose all the different metrics we can, and if they work together, they work together, and there's no reason that everything has to be perfect. And maybe multiple definitions are good, morphology and genetics. We follow both. Maybe that's better. I point all these out because I want to say that really there's no answer to these questions. This is perfect fodder for first-year undergraduates to just sit and stare at the wall and go, whoa, man. That's exactly what happens. This happened to me last night looking this up. So, Judy Hay had a really good point that there are conflicting motivations for taxonomists. On the one hand, they want to categorize and identify organisms. Great, me too. On the other hand, they want to understand the evolutionary processes that give rise to species. This goes back to the incipient problem. Is a bird, or is the bird about to be another bird? Right? You can't define something while trying to define what it's going to be and what it is. It's like you can't look at a car in the street and identify how fast it's going at any given point in time. You can either identify how fast it's going over its length of time, or you can identify it at a given point and not know the speed. So that's really tough. It makes identifying species hard. So Hay also writes, the species problem is the long-standing failure of biologists to agree on how we should identify species and how we should define the word species. So I think at this point, I certainly felt like this crow I took a photo of in Iceland. It's just really bedraggled and confused and picking at the carcass of long dead philosophies, trying to understand what it all means. But remember, this is just for species. What is a subspecies? Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's tough. I'm right with you, Mr. Raven. It's really hard. So let's back up a bit. Let's not focus on the actual names of things or what species are or what subspecies are, because it's just confusing. Let's consider the Merganser of the field, how it grows. Right, this is Merganser americanus. I took this photo somewhere in Vermont, I forget where. It's a nice bird. You see it has this nice red bill, deep blood red. You see it's got a sloping forehead. Look at that slope. It's almost like someone bent it with a spoon or a thumb, it's so gentle. It's like the hills of the Taconics. And you can see the back of its head there. It has a little bit of a out push, but not too much. It's white, it's black. You can see a tiny little hook on the end of its beak, really tiny, a little nail as it's called. And this is a goosander. Same species, different subspecies. The goosander is the British name for this bird. And if we look at this bird, the merganser, we can see it's actually quite different. What we have here is quite a steep forehead. Not the same, not as sloped. I'll stop with the accent. We have this little mohawk going on at the back there, buddy. It looks almost like it's got a mullet. It's kind of sticking out a lot more. And look at the nail on the front. There's a water droplet there, but you can see it's quite a bit bigger. Here's another good look at the goosander. Much better bird to identify as the subspecies. Taxonomists often use type specimens, like the first one to hunt a bird. This would be a great type specimen because it's a bird you can go and compare all of the birds to and be like, yep, it has the same forehead as that one. Good. Steep forehead. huge nail on the end of the beak, a nice red colored beak. I'm told that the color is different for people whose eyes don't parse red and green incorrectly, like mine. So you'll have to let me know. And then look at that mullet. Man, this bird could rock out in a hairband in the 80s. This bird's a member of Rush. Love it. And here's some American birds, photographed by Kyle Tansley here in Vermont. Look at that sloped forehead, totally different than the previous bird. Look at the nail, not nearly as big. And that color is a brighter red on the beak, isn't it? And there's no mullet, except on the female. Female's rocking it still. It's good, but very different birds. British bird, American bird. And you can see here that Goosander and Mergansers are actually quite different. You can see why this is a subspecies. It makes a lot of sense. Very different, very different. That's great. They're dissimilar and similar. Linnaeus must be satisfied. He can finally sleep in his grave. So this is all really cool. So subspecies do have a meaning, which is excellent. And we've come to the conclusion that, well, we don't really know what species are. We don't really know what subspecies are. But for right now, pragmatically, Goosander and Merganser are different. Great. So you might be asking yourself, well, why am I bringing this up at all? And as all of you know, I hope, there's a really cool site out there called eBird. And eBird is really useful for logging birds. And it's useful for sharing with other people in the community what birds are. And this is where I first got interested in what subspecies are and how they exist and how they work. Those are some stats. A lot of people use eBird. I like the complete checklist there. That doesn't count all the thousands of checklists made by everyone driving across I-89 looking at red-tailed hawks, right? That's just actual birding incidences. More time has been spent on this than probably has been spent on building the pyramids, right? A lot of time. That's a Eurasian spoonbill going like, wow, this is cool. And then consider Vermont eBird, right? This is the eBird bit here in Vermont. It's a subchapter of eBird. It's all the notifications and all the checklists here in Vermont go to Vermont eBird, which is great. And they have their own little community, which we all love. 10,000 birders. That's like 1% of the state. It's pretty great. A lot of people. Or 3% of the state, actually. Excellent. A lot of checklists. And it's some good species. This is the top rated photo. It's incredibly beautiful. Good job, Kyle. And then we have the checklist and the logging of subspecies. eBird gives you the option when you log birds while you're out to see if you can log the subspecies level, which is pretty cool. So a good rule is that the uppercase ones are easy to do and lowercase ones not so much. So it's hard to read here because it's pretty distant, and I'm sorry, but house finch common, you can identify pretty easy. American robin migratorius, lowercase m, it's a bit more difficult there, but maybe you can do it. This was a really good day. I saw like 9 subspecies in a 10-minute thing over on Liberty Street. It made me so happy. So what happens when you log subspecies, though, is it goes out on the eBird alerts. So eBird alerts is a way that we can all know what people have seen nearby. You can set these up on your account, and it's really cool. You can see what's around that you haven't seen before and get a notification at the end of the day, I missed these birds, or every hour. Here's Alan Strong seeing a horror redpoll a couple days ago. I removed his house location because it doesn't need to be on this video, but pretty cool. The problem is that it also sends alerts for subspecies. Not all subspecies. It depends on the regional reviewer, and it depends on the subspecies. But every time you log a subspecies, everyone who signed up to the alerts gets a notification. So everyone here, I'm sure many of you, and I'm so sorry, have heard every time I saw a white-breasted nuthatch outside my house that I identified to the subspecies. And this like it's kind of a weird feature. They really shouldn't send alerts to people who don't want alerts for these particular birds, but eBird does, and it's my job as a birder to identify birds, so I'm just going out and identifying them. That's kind of fun. And when I realized that everyone who sets up alerts gets these emails, I actually wanted to do it right, and that's where I started onto the subspecies idea and started learning about them a lot, because I realized, well, that's kind of cool that you can do this, and I want to make sure I'm not wrong, right? I have to write a comment every time there's a filter. And I can go more into this in depth for those of you who don't use eBird. I'm trying not to make this an eBird only talk, and I'm so sorry. I just want to talk about how I got interested in subspecies in the first place. And basically, it's a way of logging birds, just like taking down your Sibley book and saying, okay, that's that species. It gives you options. So the bird that's most commonly identified on eBird, probably here in Vermont as a subspecies, is the white-breasted nuthatch. This is a great backyard bird. We can all identify it. And if you can't, that's what it looks like. It's really awesome. It's kind of a light blue back. It's got a little black head stripe, got white flanks. This one looks kind of pinkish to me, but I'm probably wrong. It's got this nice upturned bill, and it often is in this position of just sort of hanging down, facing down on a tree. I don't know how this bird is actually hanging onto the bark. Its feet aren't attached. Must have been a weird moment. But the eastern subspecies looks exactly like this one. It has a light blue back, white flanks, chestnut colored vent. This is different than the western ones, which are dark blue on the back. Maybe have a little rust color in the flanks. Maybe have a little brown in the flanks, and maybe don't have a chestnut colored vent. Maybe it's darker red or bluish. Really fascinating. What's also cool about this bird is that the subspecies, the eastern subspecies, Sitta carolinensis, is the only one which makes this particular cool sound called a yank, also called a quank sometimes. Sounds like this. Hope you all heard that. It was like, it's a really interesting, nice little yank. That sounded more like red-bellied woodpecker, but let's pretend it was the sound you just heard. If you hear that sound, you've identified it to the subspecies now. How cool is that? Really easy to do. It's the only subspecies that does that. If you want, you can go on eBird and the Macaulay Library and look at white-breasted nuthatches from other areas and figure out how they sound, but you won't hear them yank. You won't hear recordings of them yanking, which is cool. How cool. Sweet. We've learned a subspecies together. Now we have cardinal, merganser, and nuthatch. Great. So eBird follows a lot of taxonomists. Remember I said groupings at the beginning? This isn't just an eBird thing. And again, I'm sorry if this is an eBird-centric talk. It's the most useful tool I've found. But groupings are really interesting. A grouping is basically a taxonomist way of saying these birds are similar together in their subspecies. These subspecies are like these subspecies are different. Which really makes you wonder if, this subspecies a different intermediate rank between species and subspecies? And if so, why don't we have groupings as a technical term? I don't have an answer for that question. Intraspecific clades could also be used as a term. Kind of fun. But the grouping is basically, on eBird, a way of saying these birds can be identified in the field to this grouping, but not further. The issue again with subspecies is that often they look very, very similar. They're all the same species of bird, but they're just broken up in these certain ways. And so grouping's a way of saying, well, we think you can identify these really easily, but these other ones, we can't break that down, so we'll put that in a group. So over here we have an American robin, Turdus migratorius. This is the migratorius grouping on eBird. It's also the migratorius grouping on other taxonomist list. And you can tell because it has a large white chin patch, kind of not really evident here, but an orange breast. I hope that's orange. And a gray mantle. I can't see the mantle here. I'll get to that in a second. The migratorius grouping contains Turdus migratorius, Turdus migratorius acrosteris, Turdus migratorius carinus, Turdus migratorius. I can't pronounce Latin names very well, even though I teach Latin. Awkward. But 5 subspecies, which is kind of cool. And so because they're all very similar in location and range, some of these live in Delaware, some in Virginia. So let's just put them all together because they basically all look the same to the average person going outside with binoculars. Nigridius is a subspecies that lives in Newfoundland, and it comes south on migration, and it'll come through Vermont. Not many of them. Newfoundland's not a very big island. Well, it is, but comparatively. But it's its own subspecies that's not part of the migratorius grouping. And you could tell because it has a black mantle. Mantle's right at the back of the neck there, right next to the nape. And it has a much thinner throat patch and a red breast. Look at the red there. It's different than the orange, isn't it? And there's only one subspecies in this grouping on eBird. So it's just given its normal name, Nigridius. This was taken in Massachusetts, this photo. You can see here's a normal migratorius. See how different that is? Orange breast, gray back of the neck here. This is what we're looking for when we're looking for Nigridius, the mantle. Mantle's just the German word for cloak. So you can imagine someone putting on a jacket, right? Mantle right here at the back. The blue arrow points it out. And let's see. There's another shot of the back there. You can see it's blacker, right? Not a great image. And that's one of the reasons why actually this bird is hard to identify as a subspecies. But generally, if you see a bird looks like this, orange, gray mantle, large throat patch, you got a migratorius. And probably actually the nominate here in Vermont, I believe, which is Turdus migratorius. And you do it this way, you know, it's black, deep red, really thin throat patch, really marked difference between the black head and the white eye patches. Isn't that cool? Also, this one kind of has a thing like a horned lark going on. You see this little tuft hanging out like a tufted duck. That's not normal. That's not part of the species. That's just this particular individual, which is pretty funny. But you can see this is nigridius. That's kind of cool. We learned something else. That's a tough one to do. And you should really justify that with a lot of paragraphs when you're talking to your friends. But hey, that's cool. So that's what a grouping is. It's another way. And so as you go down and start learning about subspecies, you start learning about all these weird, cool edge cases, like that one. Got a lot of birds here. There's a resident, and then every now and then there's one that migrates through. How cool is that? Well, the house finch has other cool stuff too. This is the house finch. Nice red there. This is it singing, or it's about to sing. And there's two groupings of house finches. The common, which is most of the species, and then McGregor's. McGregor's is on a small island off of California. And it's basically identical. Like, there's really almost no way to tell them apart in the field. But as far as we know, all the McGregors are extinct. They're all gone. There was probably a cat on that island. That happens to a lot of island birds. Island birds are like the first to go when species go. And so every single bird that you have in Vermont is going to be a common, especially as they're introduced. In fact, every bird you're going to have here is probably going to be a Hemorrhous mexicanus frontalis subspecies that were introduced in Long Island in the 60s, according to my research. I'm not entirely, don't quote me on any of this stuff unless you want to, but pretty much going to be frontalis, probably going to be common because the other one's extinct and it was on small islands off California. Should this mean that we should all go on eBird and start logging common house finches? In my opinion, yes. I mean, ask your reviewer in your area. Think about what you want to do with your life, but sure. Other cool birds. Great blue heron. Awesome bird. Love these things, right? They're huge. Their croaking sound is one of the most fun things. And here in Vermont, we have a blue form. You can see this here is kind of a slaty gray, kind of a blue. It's got some little white epaulettes going on there. Its neck is all tucked in. The blue form actually has a vinaceous neck, according to some taxonomists and morphologists, which is kind of funny. I think it just means slightly wine colored. I can't see that, but I hear that's a thing. But what's cool is that there are other subspecies of the great blue heron, right? There's the white form, which looks exactly like a great egret. That's down in the Caribbean. My light is flashing. Please stop. Thank you. I don't know what's going on with this light. I'm just going to turn it off. Sorry. For those of you who can see me. But the blue herons here, great blue herons, they're all blue. Pretty easy to log, kind of like the McGregor's house finch. But the cool thing about knowing the subspecies and knowing this and looking at it and being like, hey, does it have a wine-colored neck? Yes. Is it blue? Yes. Is you can tell the difference between a gray heron. That bird could be mistaken very easily for a great blue heron at a distance. Look at it. It's a heron. It's big. It's blue. So knowing the difference and identifying it to the subspecies makes you look closer. It's one of the cool things about subspecies. The more you look at a bird, the more you think about it, the more you know, oh, mantle's this bit at the back of the neck. That's cool. The more likely you are to see vagrants, more likely you are to see birds that are a little bit weird. And the more likely you are to notice your environment in new ways. Gray herons are often seen on the East Coast. By often, I mean like once a year, every 2 or 3 years or something, right? Not that often. They're in Newfoundland recently. There was one last year for one day in Martha's Vineyard, if I recall correctly. They're a bit whiter. They don't have the wine coloring, but that's really cool, right? So if you're interested, you should go learn what a gray heron looks like and then be like, okay, I'll look for that. I'll look for that. It's fun. Broadwing hawk, another cool bird. It's very similar to the house finch problem. Broadwing hawks come through in the fall. Beautiful, beautiful migrations. They have a widening gyre, turning and turning in the Champlain Valley over the hills there, hitting the thermals, rising up together. They have their wonderful scream, which I really like. Kind of sounds like a peewee to me. And the ones that come through are pretty much all the northern form, as far as I can tell, right? Buteo, Platypteris, Platypteris. Platypteris means flat-footed, if I recall correctly. I should look that up. What's interesting is that there's other forms of broad-winged hawk, which you could identify on eBird in particular. And they're all endemics to like the Antilles and the Caribbean. This bird here was taken in Vermont, this photo. Is it going to be a northern grouping bird? Almost certainly, yeah. Could it be a bird from Antigua? It's possible. We had a caracara here last April, if anyone remembers. Crested caracara is a bird from Texas. It should not be here. We've had 2 now in the past year. Weird. Weird things happen with birds. Now, can you identify if this was an endemic bird or a northern broadwing hawk? Almost certainly no. It'd be almost impossible in the field to identify these birds. The groupings are on eBird, the database we use, because of people who want to identify them when they're actually on Antigua and the like. I think they're there for morphologists. They're not there for everyone in the field to know, as far as I can tell. And this is one of the tough things to know about logging subspecies, is that sometimes you can tell and sometimes you can't. If you had this bird in hand, as it's called, you had caught it in a net and you were banding it or something, you might be able to tell the difference by looking at the length of the outer primaries or something similar. But looking at this wire on this bird, all I can really do is appreciate that it is a broad-winged hawk and that it's quite pretty and that it and I are together in this field enjoying this late summer day. Excellent. Pine siskins. Love these birds. Super, super cool. 2 main groupings on eBird. The northern and the Chiapas grouping. Northern ones are the ones you get here. Here's the northern one. This is right outside my house. It's got this beautiful kind of checkered underbelly there. Look at those little dashes coming through. And it's got this nice white superlaurel, no, it's not superlaurel, supercilium line. It's not totally pronounced, but it's there, which is weird. This subspecies shouldn't have that, but I've seen them a lot, so I don't really know what's going on with people. It's got these white undertail coverts right underneath the tail feathers. I would use my mouse to show you if I could. Coverts are basically, look at its butt, and the little bit that sticks out there beneath the tail feathers. Those are the coverts. Those are white. And streaking, superlinear line is shouldn't be there, but is. Here is a Chiapan bird. Chiapas is a state in Mexico where there's the other main grouping on eBird that you can identify. Spinus pinus perplexus. It's not a streak, is it? And it really does. This is not the best photo, but it really does have a nice supercilium, the eyebrow line. And look at that undertail coverts right underneath the bottom of the tail there. That's not white. That's a bit grayer or duskier. So that's cool. You can identify the difference now. Excellent. Northern versus Chiapas. What's this bird? Pat Folsom saw this in 2009 in Lincoln, Vermont. There's redpolls in here. You can see the redpoll. There's one looking at us with its beady little eye and its red little cap. Poll, of course, means head. That's where the poll tax comes from. But there's this green bird. It's yellow mostly to me, but I think it's green to you. And that's a morph. A morph is not a subspecies, but it's darn cool. And you can log morphs on eBird as well. So you can log a pine siskin green morph. And even if you don't care about the app, how cool would it be to look out at a whole zipper of pine siskins hanging out at your feeder and notice a green morph one, right? This is kind of what the best thing about looking at subspecies is. Like, you learn about all these different types of things that aren't subspecies, but are pretty close. And you get to be like, oh, sweet. I hope I see that someday. I haven't seen one of these yet. I'm looking forward to it. Here's another cool bird. 2 main groupings. This is another island endemic issue bird, like the house finch or the broad-winged hawk. The northern saw-whet owl comes through. We banned them at North Branch Nature Center. Here's that happening. This is a harmless thing for the bird, so don't worry. I know it looks a bit traumatic. I took this photo because I want you to see the wing there. The white spots on the coverts and remiges, just another fancy word for flight feathers. Taxonomists love their Latin. For that, they must be forgiven. are not infused with buff. I don't really know what that means, but I assume it means they should be dark brown or something, and they're not here. You can look at photos on Haida Gwaii, where over in British Columbia, there's a chain of islands there, Haida Gwaii, and they have their own endemic species, the Saw-whet Owl, which is different, which has white spots in the covers from images infused with buff. Got a few other slight differences as well, but this is one of the easiest ways to tell. And so at the banding last fall, we logged northern saw-whet owls, Acaticus subspecies, this subspecies. And it was the first time it really been logged in Vermont. And this is actually really common, for me at least, when you're logging subspecies. Not that people have done it before, because no one sits and looks at the outer images of a saw-whet owl when you're banding them. You'd rather just look at the owl. It's pretty cool. Look at that thing. And everyone knows it's going to be Acaticus. It's the only bird that's going to be here. Why would it be a bird from Haida Gwaii? To which I would proudly retort, well, you wouldn't know if you don't look. So I checked all these birds. That was fun. 27 that night. What a good night that was. Here's another really cool bird. This is not a species, the Myrtle and Audubon's Warbler, anymore. Some of you may remember when it was. Now this is the yellow-rumped warbler. This bird was discovered last fall, I think it was November, around half a mile from the Dick Sizzle at Waterbury Reservoir and the golf course by Avery Fish. This is an Audubon's warbler. It looks like the yellow-rumped warblers, the butterbutts, the myrtle warblers that we see so commonly here, especially in the spring, and they come to in massive swarms of like hundreds. Go to Sodom Pond and watch them eat the insects. It's beautiful. But this one has a yellow throat. It's not very clear in this photo because I think it was the end of the day, maybe in the morning, but it has a yellow throat. That's kind of cool. And the eye ring's a bit different. And there's 3 groupings of this bird. There's some other ones, Goldman's down in Mexico. But the Myrtle is here on the East Coast, and the Audubon's is on the West Coast. Remember how geography was a differentiator between subspecies? Well, this one, very interestingly, regularly shows up. Not to breed, but in November. You often get late vagrants of these birds. It's one of the reasons why I don't like geography as a really tell of whether a species is here or not. Birds move. They have wings. So that's kind of a cool thing to look for when you're out there. Check every butterbutt you can. If it has a yellow throat, whew. And then, of course, no talk on subspecies in Vermont would be complete without a short discussion of redpolls. Redpolls is a good example of a species complex. And it's called complex because it's just really complex, man. It's just people don't know. The best way I know how to identify a bird is to put it on iNaturalist or the Facebook Finch group and ask Matthew Young to identify it for me. Other best way is to hope for other people to help out, really lean on the shoulders of giants for this one. I know a friend of mine here, Zach, who gave a talk on owls, has never seen one of these hoary redpolls. Those are the top 2 birds because he just hasn't found one that he's really satisfied with yet. Which is, I feel you on that one. These are tough. But here, this one day, Nathaniel Sharp and I went out birding a month ago, and we saw 4 different species in this complex, subspecies in this complex, in the same day. 2 hoary redpolls, the top one, Hornomani, the second one, Exilpes, and then 2 common redpolls. Bottom one, Flammea, the normal one here, and then the other one, the Rostrata Icelandica. It's probably an Iceland or a Greenland bird. It's a bit darker. You see how it's like the bottom right there. It also has a bit more brown on the neck than the Flammea next to it. These birds are really tough. They all sort of flock together. Maybe they breed together. Maybe there's intergrades. Maybe there's hybrids. Maybe there's not. Hard to tell. Remember before when I was saying, what's a species? What's a subspecies? And we had that raven looking very sad. Yeah, that's how I feel looking at redpolls. That's how I feel. Yeah. But it's kind of cool. It's fun. Hornomani, that was the first bird we had photographed in this state of a Hornomani. It's just awesome. So keep an eye out. You could tell it's Hornomani because it has almost no streaking at all, and it's just a chunky bird. That bird eats redpolls for breakfast. It's great. So we talked about species complex a bit. What are not subspecies? We can just remove these from the table. Well, the rock pigeon, the feral pigeon, is not really a subspecies. All rock pigeons are rock pigeons. The reason we call them feral pigeons is because they're all at some point descended from pigeons that were domesticated. All the ones in North America are introduced, right? They don't naturally live here. They're from Europe. There's one exception to this, which is if you go to the Outer Hebrides of Scotland and you see a pigeon, as I have done once, and I yelled, hurrah, because it was the only one that's just a rock pigeon, just a rock pigeon, never domesticated on the Hebrides, and it's still a stable genetic stock from the wild pigeons. Super cool. The mallard domestic types are not subspecies. You'll see a lot of mallards that look weird because they were just, domesticated at one point, and then we selected for certain genes like white coloration, and then they got out into the wild, and now you have a mallard floating around, and it's all white, and you're like, why is this mallard here? And then your wife says, well, maybe it's time for dinner. Yeah. Yep. Hybrids are not subspecies. Hybrids are where the biology concept for species breaks down, because sometimes they actually are able to have children. You do have mallards and American black ducks that are integrated. As many as, 80% of American black ducks have some mallard in them, or vice versa. It's really, really common. This is particularly advanced when you get humans coming in and messing things up and having birds all flock together to get rid of us. We interrupt their range, they start breeding together, and things turn out different than nature intended. Gynandromorphs are not subspecies. They're super cool. That's where you get a bird that's half female, half male. There was a cardinal around a few weeks ago in Pennsylvania that looked like this. Very rare, super cool. Types. You red crossbills and evening grosbeaks and pine grosbeaks, actually, you could all type them based on their calls. You could say this one sounds like this grouping, and they come from over here. Why these aren't species, I have no idea. That's what I'm going with for that one. I wish I had more to tell you, but I don't know. But they're not. And then, yep, I've got to look that one up too. I'm really sorry. I don't know what a species is. That's my defense, actually. I'm going to go with that one. And then if you're using eBird, and again, sorry for you non-eBirders out there, I respect you immensely for avoiding the horror that is listing. Slashes, where you're not sure which is which, that's just you didn't identify it down to the bird. Sometimes it's also hard to. Acanthus spa, you didn't identify it down to the species. That's just a genus. Duck spa, you identify it down to it look like a duck. And then bird spa, those aren't subspecies. Those are just, sometimes you don't see a bird well enough, and you have to use these things to say, well, I think it's pretty. I think it's a bird. It might be Godzilla, but pretty sure it's a pigeon. So this is just some examples of what aren't subspecies, which is a good heuristic for, is a bird a subspecies? Is it not one? No, it's a rock. Well, that's good. We've learned something. So you all may be wondering, how do you know these things? Where did I learn this? And the answer is you have to put on the tonsure, as this red-winged blackbird does, of a monk, and go sit in a monastery and shave the top of your head and really just try to learn things wherever you can. And you'll be wrong a lot. I'm wrong all the time. I submitted so many pine grosbeak taiga subspecies, and I really shouldn't have, because I didn't read close enough. Easiest place to learn is on eBird. You can go to the map setting, the species map, and you can type in pine siskin, and it'll show you all the possibilities for pine siskin. It's the best way of doing it. I would take a photo and show you here, but it actually breaks the copyright restrictions of eBird. So does iNaturalist. I checked both the terms of services, and I really want to make sure that this isn't taken down. And I like respecting copyright, which is why I've done that. So I'm sorry I can't show you, but eBird is one of the best places. Cornell also runs Birds of the World. Birds of the World is an online resource of every single bird species in the world, with huge pages called the Systematics page on most American subspecies. It is awesome because it'll tell you what the groupings are with little drawings with all the subspecies in there, and it'll tell you what the subspecies look like. iNaturalist does the same thing. They show the taxonomies, and you can identify down to taxonomies. The thing to do with all of these resources, the Sibley Guide, your Peterson Guide, the Pile Guide, if you really want to go banding, Google Scholar, if you want to find resources like scientific articles, the thing to do is to look at a bird, figure out what the range is for the subspecies that's probably here, and then eliminate any other subspecies you can by saying this is different than that. That's what I do. It works really well, I think. Try to figure out what birds are probably here, and then how do I know it's that subspecies and not anything else? And to do that, you just need to research. There's no excuse for hitting the road. Highly suggest keeping a record. I did that. So I went through and I wrote down every single species of bird in Vermont, and I went and looked up every single subspecies, and I wrote down all the details I could on them. I have a huge spreadsheet. I can share it with anyone. It's publicly available. That'd be cool. But I also am trying to write this all down on my website. So this is a shameless plug for birdinginvermont.com. I've tried to name this differently than Bird Watching in Vermont by Ted Murin and Brian Pfeiffer. I'm not sure I did that totally well, and for that I apologize. I should apologize more to them. But birdinginvermont.com. I have whole write-ups and essays on subspecies and how you can tell what subspecies is here. Hopefully this is useful. If you want another subspecies in there, let me know and I'll write it up. Takes me a few hours and I have to go through a lot of books, but I'm happy to do that. There's also other stuff on birding in Vermont. If you want to go check out nocturnal flight calls when birds flying over your house, I write about that. Or if you want to see what towns you've birded in or what regions you've birded in, Project 251 is a cool project. We're trying to see if we can bird in all the towns of Vermont this year. We already have half of them. I haven't announced it yet anywhere except here, but that's super cool and hope you all get excited. So yeah, birdinginvermont.com if you want to learn more about how I know whether a subspecies is something. And again, I'm often wrong. I'm just a dude who likes looking at birds. No formal qualifications here, excepting for the philosophy stuff, in which case linguistics might help, which is my background, but whatever. So as we're reaching the end of the hour here, why does this matter? Why does it matter that we identify subspecies? Well, it really matters a lot if you think of conservation. Knowing what's there, it makes it so much easier to get money from bigwigs. So much easier to get people interested and excited. This is the peregrine falcon. These birds were brought back from the brink. And knowing that there's a subspecies that comes and breeds in Vermont and caring for that subspecies is excellent. The grasshopper sparrow, there's a Florida version of it that's a subspecies that we're really trying to protect right now. There's a great ABA podcast on it. Knowing that there's a subspecies that's in danger makes it really, really easy for the scientific community to get behind trying to protect that subspecies. Awesome. We want to protect the natural world. All of us here are nature lovers. If you're not, I really don't know why you wasted an hour listening to me. And why do we as birders go out and identify birds, for instance, on eBird and alert everyone in the state? Well, because it's fun. And because it's cool to see how populations change. And because why do we do anything in life? Like, what are we here for? Me, I'm here to figure out where I am in the universe. And the best way for me to do that is to name things. I like naming things. This is what I do. Don't know why. Always have. So that's as good as an answer as I can give. Conservation's a better one, but why do I get up in the morning? Well, maybe I just want to hear a nuthatch. So with that, go see some birds. Get out there. See some cool stuff. Feel free to email me with it whenever, with whatever questions you have. I hope this was useful. I'm sorry for all my mistakes. Blame Sean. And thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Richard. Yeah, feel free to blame me for any mistakes. We're going to have this recorded. The presentation will be up on our website, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations. I wanted to say another quick thank you to Green Mountain Audubon Society for putting this on with us. And another thank you to Richard as well for not just your presentation, but all of your research into all this and helping the whole community move forward on our identification of subspecies. I want to invite folks to ask questions, and if you throw them in the chat bar, I will see them and I will relay them right now. But I wanted to share just a couple of really amazing reflections on this, Richard. Thanks so much. I didn't, I love that I'm looking at the nuance of subspecies and also like my entire existence as a human being at the same time. So thank you for the injection of philosophy and existentialism into this.
I try.
I love that the idea of looking at subspecies in many ways becomes a group project, and it becomes group birding after the fact, right? We can share a photo saying, I don't know what this is. And somebody can say, oh, well, look at the supercilium, look at the undertail coverts. And, we can, and ends up being a project to look at birds more carefully than we often do. And then the other piece that I thought was really fascinating was that if somebody asked me to draw, I know a robin when I see one, and a robin when you see one, but if you asked me to draw a robin, I wouldn't be able to do it precisely, right? But
yep.
looking more deeply, looking at that subspecies, you learn what a robin looks like.
100%. I know way more since trying to be smart and trying to learn all the names of all the feathers than I did before. It's one of the most useful things you could do is try to learn subspecies because it makes you look harder, which is awesome.
Could you elaborate a little bit, Richard, on kind of the etiquette around when you go ahead and list something as its subspecies on eBird, and particularly like not assuming the subspecies just because you happen to be in the range, but ruling out the like the Antiguan thing first.
Yeah, so you should definitely not log subspecies just because you're in the area and you know it's a bird. That's a no-go according to eBird's protocols. The thing to do when you log a subspecies is to include a few ways that you know it's that bird and not other bird subspecies. So you want to eliminate everything else. Use a dichotomous key, as it's called, to figure out what it is. So for the white-breasted nuthatches, I often mostly just write Yanks or this bird was yanking because I know, and Zach, my reviewer here, knows, and most interested scholars interested in looking at the subspecies for this bird would know that the yanking eastern subspecies does that and other species don't. For birds like the robin or this taiga pine grosbeak here, you would really want to write more. So for this one, you'd probably want to write female, possibly first year, immature male. Describe the bird. Olive head, white subocular stripe. None of that really matters for this bird so much as I heard it give 3 whistled calls. If you hear it give 3 whistled calls, that's in the literature pretty clearly as probably being a taiga bird, a Lucura subspecies. So you want to include the most salient information up front to say this is what I is and this is how I know it's this subspecies, not anything else. Hope that helps.
Yeah, I think there's a interesting another thing that you mentioned I think is really relevant too is that we as biologists, as taxonomists, as birders, we are all getting better and better at this, and we are newly identifying different groupings, different taxa of things that we didn't recognize before as being different. And so putting more information than you need in your eBird record now can help that grad student 10 years from now when they're going through 50 years of red crossbill records, identifying different types, for instance.
It's also useful for you as an exercise. It's the same reason people keep nature diaries, right? It helps you learn to see better by forcing yourself to write more. If you write about this bird, the upper mandible was the equal size as the lower mandible. You now use the word mandible. It's not a word I use very often. In fact, the northern cardinal at the beginning there, the Mexican long-crested version, has a shallower upper mandible and a less sinuous tomia, which is the line between the upper and lower mandible. I now know the word tomia. Now I've spoken it. I've never spoken that word before, but just saying that and writing it down means that you have it and other people can use it later, and the world's kind of a better place.
What's the story with pine grosbeaks in our area? Is there just one?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different pine grosbeak groupings. There's a lot of different subspecies of pine grosbeaks. Eurasian, this is a pan Palearctic, pan Holarctic species. They're really difficult and they're really hard to tell apart. There's ones in the Rocky Mountains. There's ones in the Queen Charlotte Islands. Haida Gwaii. There's the taiga subspecies is the one we probably have here in the winter. Probably. They breed up north in the subarctic, and then they come south in the winter on years when their food crop up there fails. And so we see them some years down here in Vermont. And the ones we probably have here are Lucura. They could also be from Newfoundland, which is also Lucura. It used to be its own subspecies, isn't anymore. And they all kind of look like this. Now you can tell based on the geographic range by the shape of the bill. They're somewhere in the middle range here. They're not too small a bill, not too big a bill. And by the size of the bird, here we have medium-sized pine grosbeaks, not too small, not too big. There's the smallest on Haida Gwaii, the largest probably around Manitoba, smallest on Newfoundland again. And the bill size kind of also goes in this weird east-west axis where it gets bigger towards Hudson Bay, then smaller again. And then the subocular stripe is different. It's not in all subspecies. And the olive coloration is different, especially on the flanks of the adult males. You have sort of you have more red on the flanks in the eastern subspecies than you have in most other subspecies. Also on the back in the mantle, you can have dusky coloration on the feathers and this really separated inner bit where it's slightly darker. None of this matters because it's really hard to identify from any particular bird how it's different from other birds because they're not with you and they're not there. It's like trying to size a bird. If anyone's tried to size a bird that's like not near other birds, it's hard to do. And so I submitted a lot of taiga subspecies because I misread birds of the world and I messed up. And then everyone started doing it. And I'm so sorry, everyone. I re-looked at the literature, and it turns out that the eastern birds, the Licura subspecies, the taiga subspecies grouping of this bird give whistled calls that are different. And I'm probably messed up with my vocabulary a bit. I probably could have been a lot clearer. Birds which I've seen, which I could have identified to the type specimen, as similar to the type specimen of this species, which may or may not be the species identified, give whistled calls. And so if you hear a whistled call, it's probably okay to log it as taiga, but that's only for the location call, not for the calls they give while they're just hanging out in the crab apple tree talking to each other. So you have to hear it give a call while it's flying. And it can't be the trill call. It has to be the whistle call that's like 3. It sounds like a lesser yellowlegs or greater yellowlegs if you're, there's difference on that one. But one of those. Yes, it's possible. But there you go. Make sense?
Clear as plain as day. Plain as day.
With 3 whistled calls, you're probably good. Otherwise, pine grosbeak is a better way to put it.
Speaking of calls, would you give us a, so since we are approaching, eventually we'll be approaching nocturnal flight call season and spring migration. Do you want to give us a little bit of a, quick elevator pitch for some of the nocturnal flight call things you've been paying attention to?
Sure. So nocturnal flight calls, birds fly at night during migration most of the time. Not all birds, but most birds. And just like cars, they like beeping and saying, don't hit me, don't hit me. I'm here, I'm here. Are you there? I'm here, I'm here. Are you there? And they all use the same sort of call. It's a flight call. Not every bird gives a flight call. Some birds are really silent and we don't know what they are, but some birds do. And for some birds, we know because it matches the call they give diurnally during the daytime. And so we can tell that if we record or just go outside and look up and cup our ears and listen, if you don't have such bad hearing as me, you can hear the birds fly over. And it's super cool. You can also take a telescope and look at the moon and see them fly over on moonlit nights. Now, a lot of great researchers have been doing a lot of work on redetermined migration, or birds that are migrating at night and then go too far over water and come back to land in the morning, and they record the birds flying over and identify them visually. And so we have this huge dictionary. Mostly Evans is the person for this. Evans, and there's another person who wrote that book, and I always forget his name, and I feel really bad about that right now. Look it up later. But there's a whole community of nocturnal migrants. Huh?
Bill Evans.
Yeah.
And Don Kreutzma.
Kreutzma is another one. There's giants out there upon whose shoulders we must so humbly stand, and they have this whole community. And we've been trying to get one set up here in Vermont. We have a listserv, and we have some people with buckets. I have a bucket on my deck. I'm going to be having a bucket on my car this year, I hope. And we go out and we record birds at night, and then we use automatic software to identify when they're calling, so we don't have to listen to the entire night again because we were sleeping. And we can actually identify birds based on their flight calls. And it's super fun, super techy and nerdy, but it's a really cool way of learning what's going on. And because of that, Blanchard Park, the small pocket park behind my house here in Montpelier, has over 100 species of birds in it. We've seen upland sandpiper and dick sizzle and American bittern and just the weirdest birds in the middle of downtown Montpelier because they've flown over at night. Super cool.
All right, last chance for questions in the chat bar, please. I'll say one more quick thank you to Green Mountain Audubon Society. Check out northbranchnaturecenter.org if you're new to us. Go ahead and sign up for our mailing list so you can keep an eye on the different events we have coming up. And I'll mention that we have Rosemary Moscow on 2 weeks from tonight. So March 17th. Yeah, Rosemary Moscow, March 17th. She's the artist of Bird and Moon comics, who's going to be talking to us about comedy and birds and how do you communicate nature with humor. And so I'm looking forward to that. So join us in a couple of weeks for that. And I will spare you all the other things coming up. You can check it out yourself at northbranchnaturecenter.org. Let's see. If folks need to head out, you're welcome to. I do have one quick question in the chat bar here. Let's see. Oh, well, okay. So this is not so much about subspecies, but why would I have seen evening grosbeaks in Underhill in previous years, but not recently?
That's a really good question. Evening grosbeaks are another one of these winter finches, which some years erupts. That's erupts with an I. And basically, what it means is that they were mostly up north. Most of them breed up there. Some evening grosbeaks do breed in the state, but their food crop failed probably because of the drought last year or because of variation in spruce budworm or other things that they're eating, birch catkins and the like. And so some years they all come south in numbers. And so this year was one of those years. Evening grosbeaks were everywhere. Year before, barely any in the state. Super, super rare. And it goes in these huge cycles. Pine grosbeaks does the same thing, so do common redpolls. And it's really interesting to watch. This year was a super flight. Every single bird was here that could be here. It was great.
And a lot of the things have moved. I remember there being a lot of evening grosbeaks early on in the winter, and now it seems like things have thinned out a bit. And I haven't
They
seen.
kept going south. They didn't want to stick around. There was evening grosbeaks as far south as Florida this year, which is just weird. Super cool.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap things up here, folks. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a great rest of your week and a great weekend, and enjoy your birding and enjoy birding more closely from here on out. And take care. Thank you, Richard.